All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month. In the schus of Rafush for their niece Chava Tzipora Bas Chaya Malka. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she together with Kol Choli Yisrael will have a complete and enduring refuah. To thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Matt and Diana Marks, and for thanking the Shul for their Hachnasas Archim. Shkoyach, thank you. We also wish the Marks the Mazel Tov and much Hatzlach on their new home, Emir Sashem. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Mrs. Esther Parnas, with birthday wishes to Shalom Parnas. Admeh ve'esim shana. May you continue to grow in your avodas Hashem and Torah. Truly beautiful. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, an exciting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Tzadik Hey 95. We left off on Tzadik Dalid Amud Beis. And we left off, actually, I think we left off about 17 lines down from the top. So a lot to do. So just to reorient ourselves a little bit, does that look about right? 17 lines down from the top? Good. So we'll say, I know we left a lot of Amud Beis over. So remember again, just to reorient ourselves a little bit, we saw a fascinating Mishnah yesterday, the reverse case of everything we've been dealing with up until now, which is up until now we were speaking about a situation of a husband who is going overseas and testimony about the loss of the husband. We now reversed the case a little bit, and this became a situation of the wife traveling overseas, and ultimately the impact then that has on the husband. We then further complicated the case by talking about it's not just the pshat that the wife went overseas, but rather what happened. A wife and her brother-in-law. So ultimately, again, Rachel and Shimon, her brother-in-law, go overseas, and ultimately they get testimony that they both died, and now they, meaning their respective husband and wife, get testimony that they both died, and Ruvain ends up marrying Leah, his sister-in-law. So then again, Rabbi say the Mishnah discusses the ramifications of that. Of course, it turns out that they're both alive. The piece we left off with yesterday was Rabbi Akiva, right? So the Gemara wanted to suggest that according to Rabbi Akiva, so remember, the novelty in the Mishnah's ruling, although it's not so novel as we'll discuss, but the novelty is, let's play this out. So Ruvain marries Leah, Rachel's sister, because he received testimony that Rachel was dead. Okay, Rachel's not dead. Rachel's alive. So Rachel comes back. What did the Mishnah paskin? That Rachel and Reuven are permitted to resume their marriage. The Gemara was asking that according to Rabbi Akiva, this should not be the case. Why? See, I will say, according to Rabbi Akiva, when it turns out that Rachel is alive as well as Ruvain, right? As well as Shimon, right? Shimon ultimately, again, going ahead, Shimon being Leah's husband, when it turns out that they are alive. Jerry, welcome. I think this is like Mamish. We'll say Reb Jerry has been our connection to Eretz Yisrael since the beginning of the pandemic. Baruch Hashem. So I'm sorry, I was so convinced that we would be zocha to join you there. But okay, Emir Sashem, they will come. So we'll say, so remember again, according to Rabbi Akiva, halacha l'maisa, when it turns out that Rachel is alive, so ultimately, again, Reuven is obligated to give Leah a get. Now, the novelty, of course, is what? Is that even though halacha l'maisa, there was no marriage between Reuven and Leah, because remember, again, it's achos ishto. According to Rabbi Akiva, there's still an obligation. And by the way, it's not just achos ishto. I will say, what is it? What else is it? It's eshes ish. Because remember, Leah is married to Shimon. So there's no marriage here. There's no marriage here on any level. Yet, halacha l'maisa, Reuven is obligated to go ahead and give Leah a get. So if Reuven is obligated to give Leah a get, then the Gemara wants to suggest that what? That he shouldn't be able to remarry Rachel. Why not? Achos gerushaso. Because it's so strange but Rachel effectively becomes the sister of the woman you divorced. And you're not allowed to marry the sister of the woman you divorced. So the Gemara says, again, this is only on Shitas Rabbi Akiva, but according to Rabbi Akiva, ultimately, again, Ruvain should not be able to resume his marriage with Rachel. That's where he left off. So 17 lines down. So it says the Gemara, Valav Itmar Allah, 17 lines down, 94b, 17 lines down. Valav Itmar Allah, Amr Rabbi Gila, Amr Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef, Amr Rav, Hai Eishes Ach Hechi Dami. What's the case of Eishes Ach? Because Rabbi Akiva holds that halacha l'maisa you need to give a get in the case of Eishes Ach and in the case of Achos Isha. So the Gemara says, Hechi Dami, what's the case? What's the case? To which the Gemara says, Kigon shekidesh achiv es ha'isha, v'halach l'medinas hayam. What's the case? The case is where one's brother was mekadesh a woman. So we'll say, let's say Reuven was mekadesh a woman, and ultimately again, v'halach l'medinas hayam, and he went overseas. V'shama shemeis achiv, and he heard that his brother passed away. V'amad v'nasa es ishto, and then he went ahead and married the brother's wife. Right, in this case, the woman who the brother did kiddushin with. That Rabbi said that even though it turns out that halacha l'maisa, that the brother is alive, nevertheless, it requires a get. Why? Because Rabbi said the way we assume that people understand things played out was the brother must have made a t'nai in his kiddushin. The kiddushin didn't work. And therefore, this second man rightfully married this woman, and therefore halacha l'maisa, when it turns out that the brother comes back and he's not dead, the second brother is required to give a get, because otherwise, if you don't give a get, people are just going to assume that you are releasing an eishes ish without any mechanism. So what's the case of achos isha? Kigon shekidesh es ha'isha v'halcha l'medinas hayam. Listen to this. The case could be a man betroths a woman and then goes overseas. Or she goes overseas. V'shama shemesa, and ultimately again it's heard that she passed away. Ama v'nasa sachosa. She gets up and marries her sister. Say now it turns out that again she didn't die. And halacha l'maisa now again what happened? She's back. The amri inchi hach kamaisa tanai havilei b'kiddushay v'hash shaper nasav. Shabbos say, now again, what's happening over here is as follows. See, Shabbos say, you have these cases, according to Rabbi Akiva, where you do kiddushin, right? You do kiddushin with a woman, and then what happens? Right, she goes overseas, you go overseas, you think she's dead, she marries someone else, or a relative of her, she comes back. You require a get in these cases. Now, Shabbos say, you shouldn't really require a get. Why not? Because there's no marriage. But we require a get as public policy because we're concerned that people don't know the whole story. And if you just quote unquote dissolve a relationship without a get, you could have catastrophic repercussions from that because people will end up dissolving relationships without a get. And of course, that is highly problematic. To which the Gemara says, "Ela nisuin, mikal memer tanai havile." So I'll say, because again, but in the case of nisuin, what are we concerned about? So I'll say, let's play this out for just a moment over here, right? Reuven was married to Rachel. Right? Rachel went overseas. It turns out together with who? With her brother-in-law Shimon. Fine, the truth is that's not so material right now. So what happens? Reuven gets testimony that Rachel's dead. He marries Rachel's sister, Leah. Rachel comes back. So I will say, now Rabbi Akiva is saying, okay, you have to give Leah a get. To which the Gemara says, why? In other words, what are we concerned about? In other words, suppose like the only reason to require a get is because people are going to emerge with some type of misunderstanding about the circumstances. What type of misunderstanding are people going to emerge from over here? See, in the case of Kiddushin, Rabbi say, let me just contrast this, then we're going to move forward. Otherwise, we're never going to catch up with the Daf. Right, Rabbi say, so remember again, in the case of Kiddushin, right, a man is Mekadesh a woman. He goes ahead, she goes overseas, right? He goes ahead, hears that she passed away, marries her sister. Turns out that she comes back. See, Rabbi say, in Kiddushin, the reason why often you require a get for the second marriage is because Kiddushin can be done with a t'nai. with a condition. And so maybe people assume that the condition for the kiddushin was never fulfilled, and that's why the man went and married this other woman. And therefore, again, when the original wife comes back, he has to give second wife a get, because otherwise people don't know all the circumstances. But in Nisuin, there's no Tinaim. There's no Tinai with Nisuin, Rabbi. So you can't do a Tinai with Nisuin, because ultimately Nisuin often includes Bia. So you can't start with the Tinai with that. So what's the concern over here? Why would you require Ruvain to give Leah a get? Amarle Rav Ashi the Rav Kahana, Irabi Akiva, listen Mechamosas. Therefore, Rabbi say, the Gemara kind of leaves off with that, but the Gemara raises another question. If you're going to go ahead and highlight that this is like Rabbi Akiva, why don't you also include the case of mother-in-law? So the Hashemin Rabbi Akiva, the Amar Chamosa la'achar misa, lav b'sreifa. They both say, well, I'll give you another good case. Right? Reuven is married to Rachel. Rachel goes overseas. And what happens? Reuven gets testimony that Rachel's dead. And what does he do? He marries Rachel's mother. Right? Rachel's mother, his mother-in-law. Right? Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, after one's wife dies, ultimately, again, relationship with one's mother-in-law is no longer punishable by sreifa. Okay, this Sanya, Ba'ish Yisrofu Osovi Yasen. Shabbos say we're going to talk about this pasuk a lot because it's actually a very strange pasuk. The pasuk says, V'ish asher yikach es isha ve'es ima zimahi. If a man will marry a woman and her mother, so a man marries a woman and her mother, his mother-in-law, zimahi, it's znus, it's immorality. Ba'ish Yisrofu Osovi Eshen. In the fire, he and they shall be burned. Now, I will say it's not clear what the they is, right? Because the truth is, it's not like this is an act of immorality between three people, right? So we'll see exactly what the pshat is. But the point that we're making over here is Rabbi Akiva holds the Isser Streifa is only when one's wife is alive. But after the wife passes away, there's no Isser Streifa with the mother-in-law, to which the Gemara says, Ba'ish Yisrofu Osovias hen, Osovias achas men de Rabbi Shmuel. Shabbos say, ultimately, again, Rabbi Shmuel says, it means the man is put to death, and achas mehen, and one of them. Rashi says over here, Shekim b'loshon Yevani korin la'achas hena, v'am rachmana achrona shnasa be'ezrat yisarif. Shabbos say, who's put to death according to Rabbi Shmuel? The last one he married. In other words, the first woman he met, right? If he marries the mother-in-law first, it's mutter. Why is it mutter? It's a good Shabbos table riddle, because it's not his mother-in-law yet, right? In other words, a woman is only your mother-in-law after you marry her daughter. So if you marry the quote-unquote mother-in-law first, that's mutter. Then marrying the daughter is aser. It's the daughter who's chayeves. Conversely, if you marry the daughter first, ultimately again, then the mother-in-law. So Rabbi Shmuel says, Ba'ish Yisrifu Osovi Eshen. Eshen really means Eshin. He's put to death, and the second woman who he married in this triangle is put to death as well. Rabbi Akiva Omer Osovi Eshtehen. Rabbi Akiva says, no, it's him and both of them. Now, what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Osovi Eshtehen. Kedeba inon hasam besanhedrin. My benay ha vadai ishto gimura lo Rabbi Akiva de b'srei ani yazu machat a hari behedrin isis. Rabbi mashmos darshan ikemenay Rabbi Akiva savar tartik sivi chamoso ve'im chamoso. I will say, listen to this. Rabbi Akiva darshans that what it means is like this. There's actually three women here are prohibited. There's the daughter, her mother, and the mother of the mother-in-law. Right? All three of those women are prohibited to be in the same marital union. Good. That's Rabbi Akiva's drasha. So Bishlam Abai Dar Mashmaus Darshan Ikabenayu. So according to Abaye, who says that the machlokes Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Akiva is just how to darshan the pasuk. Rabbi Shmuel Savar Chadaksiv. Rabbi Shmuel on the hand understands that the word eshen actually only refers to one woman. Rabbi Akiva Savar Tartiksiv, and Rabbi Akiva holds no, eshen refers to two women, i.e. the mother-in-law and the mother-in-law's mother. El Rava Damar Chamos Ali Achamisa Ikebenaihu. According to Rava, who holds that no, the point of contention is, does the prohibition of mother-in-law continue to apply, even after the death of one's wife? Listening Nami Chamoso. then Rabbi say Rabbi Akiva should include in our Mishnah another case. What's the other case, Rabbi say? What's the additional case? The additional case should be Reuven is married to Rachel. Rachel goes overseas. Right? Instead of just framing this as a case where Reuven marries Rachel's sister Leah, let's add another dimension over here. Reuven marries Rachel's mother. Rachel's mother. That could also be a case in the Mishnah, to which the Gemara says, Nehi demiyata kra misreifa misura kamiyata kra. It's true. The Torah says that perhaps a mother-in-law after the death of one's wife is not punishable by sreifa, but she's still asura, as opposed to Rabosai, a wife's sister. A wife's sister is only asura when the wife is alive. Now, both say alive also means even if they're divorced, right? Halacha l'may says, as long as one's wife is alive, even if he's not married to her, the prohibition upon her sister still remains. So I will say, in the case of the Mishnah, we're looking for a situation where if one's wife were to die, this particular relationship would become unequivocally and absolutely permitted. There's only one case of that, which is sister, because even though mother-in-law technically is no longer punishable by sreifa after the wife dies, it's still asr. That's why I don't include it. Good. Let's go weiter. So I will say, but still I don't understand. Why don't we say that halacha l'maisa, once Reuven has relations with Leah, right, his wife's sister, Rachel should be prohibited to him. Why? To which the Gemara says, Midi dehavi aisha shalach ba'ila m'dina sayam. Because it says it should be no different than the case of the woman whose husband went overseas. We'll say, look at Rashi. It's the second to last line of Rashi. Dehavi aisha shalach ba'ila m'dina sayam. The misra l'ba'ila b'shchivas ha'acharon. The afa pi she shogeges. V'amai katan says, we'll say, let's think about the opposite case. Right? The opposite case is where the husband went overseas. Wife got testimony that her husband is dead. What did she do? She remarried. Right? Legally. It turns out now that her husband's alive. What's the halacha? She is asura, right? Labalan to Boel. So at the end of the day, why don't we say the same thing over here? In other words, why doesn't Rachel become prohibited to her husband as well? To which the Gemara says, Lo dami ishto dibemezid asira midaoraisa b'shogeg gazru b'hurabanan. I will say this is actually quite a fascinating statement. The Gemara says like this: when a woman willfully commits adultery, ultimately again she is asura midaoraisa to her husband and to the adulterer. In that case, Chazal went ahead and were gozer that even if the adultery is b'shogeg, she should still be asura. Look at the last Rashi on the Daf. Rashi says, "Dibemezid misura midaoraisa dichsevihilo nispasa demashma isura hilchach b'shogeg kigon alpi bezin gazu b'rabanan." So I will say this is fascinating. Technically speaking, an accidental act of adultery should not make a woman asura to her husband, but since intentional adultery does, the Rabbanan were gozer even in a case of we'll call it act. This is not really accident. It's the better word for accidental. It's mistaken, right? Mistaken, because it's not really even inadvertent. It's mistaken, right? Tell us, it's mistaken adultery. I mean, to be honest, adultery is always mistaken, right? It's right. It is, but again, good, you understand. So the Gemara says, Gazu b'Rabbanan, top of tzadikei, achos isha debemezid lo asira midaraisa. B'shogeg lo gazu b'Rabbanan. I will say, but listen to this. In the case of achos isha, let's say a man intentionally has relations with his wife's sister. Intentionally. Asr, does it in any way impact his marriage? And of course the answer is unequivocally yes. Right? Of course it does. Right? Halachically, does it impact his marriage? Right? I mean, again, it might put him in sakanas nefashos, but lamaisa, in other words, it doesn't make him asur to his wife. So what the Gemara is saying is like this. In a case of adultery, mistaken adultery, so Chazal were gozer and said, wife, you're ushered to the Baal and to the Boel. But in a case of where he has relations with his wife's sister, even if if she was alive, right, and he knew she was alive, and he were to go out and do that, halacha l'maisa doesn't quote unquote halachically impact his marriage. Therefore, b'shogeg lo gazu b'Rabbanan. Therefore, halacha b'shogeg, Chazal weren't gozer as well, and therefore, even in this case in the Mishnah, where he married his sister-in-law thinking that his wife was dead, and it turns out that she's alive and she's back, halacha l'maisa, his wife is not prohibited. And we'll say, Sadik Hamad Aleph, second line down. Uminalan delo asira. Now we'll say, how do I know that? That's an interesting statement, by the way. How do I know that if a man intentionally has relations with his sister-in-law, achos isha, intentionally, that does not prohibit his wife to him? How do I know that? Tisanya, osa shchivas osarta ve'in shchivas achos osarta. Both said it's actually quite fascinating. Take a look at Rashi. Pasuk says, v'shachav ish osa shchivas zera. V'nela me'ene isha, v'nistra v'hin nitma, ve'eid ein bas. This is the pasuk by adultery. Pasuk by adultery. So the Torah says, if a man will sleep with her, shchivas zera, v'nela me'ene isha, and her husband, and it's hidden from her husband. So this is the pasuk by adultery. So supposed to listen to this. So the Gemara darshans, osa shchivas osarta. It is only an act of adultery that prohibits a woman to her husband. Ve'in shchivas achos osarta. But if her husband sleeps with her sister, it does not prohibit her. In other words, both say, it is only an act of immorality that the wife herself commits that ultimately answers her to her husband. But an act of immorality done with someone other than the wife does not prohibit the wife to her husband. What's an act of morality done with someone other than the wife? If the husband has relations with his wife's sister, as much as that is usher, and it carries with it liability, I will say, to be clear, it carries with it significant liability, it does not answer the wife to her husband. Because the truth is, I could have made a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Uma b'makom sheba'al iser kal ne'esar ha'oser. They're both saying a situation where a man sheba'al iser kal. Now, I will say the wording here is a little bit strange. We're going to see what this means, right? If a man were to go ahead and transgress an iser kal, a relatively light iser, we're going to discuss what that means. So the Gemara says, Sheba'al iser kal ne'esar ha'oser. Ultimately, again, she becomes prohibited to her husband. That I will say, we're going to see, I'm going to tell you this now, and it's not going to make sense, but it'll make sense later. The iser kal they're referring to over here is adultery. The reason they're calling iser kal, adultery and iser kal, I will say why, is because ultimately, again, first of all, it's not a relation, and also it can be terminated, right? Why could it be terminated? Why? A get. As opposed to other types of arayos where they are a de facto state, right? The issue of adultery could be if a husband gives his wife a get, there's no longer an issue of adultery. So also listen to this. In a case of adultery, so if she commits the act of adultery, she becomes asura to her husband, then certainly again, in a case of an isur chamer, what's the case of an isur chamer? Achos isha. Because we must listen to this. The prohibition of achos isha applies when? Even after they're divorced. Right? This is the novelty. Once you marry a woman, her sister is asura to you for as long as the wife is alive, even if you're no longer married to her. The only time the sister becomes permitted is once the wife dies. So I might have thought makom shabal isur chamer eino din shnes haloser. So I will say, if for an isur kal, ultimately, again, a wife becomes prohibited to her husband. For an iser chamer, like achos isha, I would have thought for sure that if man has relations with his sister-in-law, his wife should become prohibited to him. Rabbi Yehuda. Therefore, I have the pasuk that says osa. Osa means it is only an act that the wife does that prohibits her to her husband, but an act that the husband does with someone else, even the wife's sister, does not prohibit the wife to her husband. Rabbi Yehuda, lo nechelku be'shnai beis Hillel beba'al chamosa sheposel seishto. Suppose say an alternate version of this. Rabbi Yehuda says, be'shnai beis Hillel don't disagree in a case of a man who has relations with his mother-in-law. That if you have relations with your mother-in-law, ultimately, again, that prohibits you from living with your wife. Aman nechlaku. Say we don't pass that way halacha l'maisa, but that's the version right now. Aman nechlaku. So what do Rishon Beis Hillel disagree with? Beba al achos ishto. Rabbi say the machlokes they have is when you have relations with your sister-in-law. Beis Shammai omrim pasal. Beis Shammai says relations with a sister-in-law prohibits a man from living with his wife. Ubeis Hillel omrim lo posel. Beis Hillel says no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. On Rabbi Yossi, no. Lo nechleku beisham beisila bebalachos al achos ishto. Alachos ishto shelo posas ishto. So Rabbi Yossi has a different version. It says no. Beisham beisila agree that even relations with your sister-in-law does not go ahead and prohibit you from living with your wife. Aman nechlaku beba'al chamoso. The machlokis is a case you have relations with your mother-in-law. Shebe Shammai omrim posel, ubeisila omrim lo posel. Beis Shammai says relations with your mother-in-law prohibit you from living with your wife. Beisila says no, it doesn't. So I'll just point out, by the way, we're going to see, we paskin halacha l'maisa with this drasha with osa. We paskin that halacha l'maisa, even if the man has relations with any of these women, his wife's sister, his mother-in-law, again, I want to be clear, he may be chayiv misa, right? Both in the hands of a beis din and by his wife. But lamaisa, he's not prohibited from continuing his marriage. It's quite fascinating. We're going to see the drasha of osa means it's only when the woman has an extramarital relationship that the inability to continue the marriage is there. The husband, I want to point out, right? Relations with your mother-in-law is a chi of misa. Relations with your wife's sister is a chi of misa. So just understand, the guy is not off the hook. He's chayiv misa. But lamaisa, it doesn't prohibit him from continuing his marriage. So the Gemara says, Lefi, so let's analyze this. It's really fascinating. Lefi, shebetchila hu muter b'chol hanashim sheba olam. So listen to this. Before you get married, right? So listen to this. So right, you ask a man, right? Before you're married, who are you muter to? And what does he say? Everyone, right? The world is my kosher oyster, right? Like, right, Lamaisa again, right? He's mutter to every woman in the world. By the way, same thing for her. She can marry any man, he can marry any woman. Kadsha, he does kiddushin. He osra, vihi asarto. So I will say, ultimately, again, the moment they have kiddushin, he prohibits her, and she prohibits him. To be clear. Right, but watch this. Umaruba isur sha'asra meisur sha'asarto. But again, to be clear, right, the nature of the prohibition that he now has is much less expansive than the prohibition that she has. Why? Shu asra b'chal nashim sheba ulam. Because we're about to say, who is she asura to? Everyone. Vehi lo asartu ela b'kravosel. But remember, again, I will say, at least before there was a ban on polygamy, ultimately, who is he usher to? Her relatives. So again, they both have a level of isser, but obviously her isser is much more expansive. Balo dinhu. So the Gemara says, make kavachomer umahi sha'asr b'chol anashim sheba olam. So let's analyze the Kavachomer Umahu when it comes to the husband, that when he marries this woman, he asers her in all of the men of the world. Shagaga ba'asrala, eina ne'eseres b'mutrala. They both say, technically speaking, on a biblical level. Shagaga ba'asrala. Let's say she inadvertently commits an act of adultery. We just saw before, midda oraisa, that does not aser her to her husband. It doesn't ask her to her husband. She is not asked to the one who she is permitted to her husband. He, shelo asar to el b'kravosel, so we'll say she, who only prohibits him in her relatives, shagag ba'asar lo, if he makes a mistake with someone who is asar to him, i.e., let's say, her sister, eno din shlo nesar lo b'motralo, ultimately, again, he certainly should not be permitted he certainly should not be prohibited to continue the marriage. V'zadin l'shogig. This is true by shogig. So we'll say we made a good kavachomer that halacha l'maisa, should a man inadvertently have relations with his sister-in-law, that would not prohibit him, or mother-in-law for that matter, that would not prohibit him from going on and continuing his marriage. I says the Gemara, who had v'zadin l'shogig l'mezid minayin. How do I even b'mezid? Even b'mezid, if a man had relations with his wife's sister, or a man had relations with his wife's mother, then halacha l'maisa, it should not preclude him from continuing the marriage. Talmud lomar osa. The boss says, goes back to osa shchivasa osarta, ve'in shchivas achosa osarta. The boss say, this is the drasha osa, v'shachav ish osa. The boss say, the only type of relationship or a illegal relationship that prevents a marriage from moving forward is a relationship that the woman engages in. But a relationship that the man engages in, it may make him chayiv misa, but lamaisa does not preclude the marriage from moving forward. So halacha lamaisa, we have successfully shown that even if a man intentionally has relations with his sister-in-law, intentionally has relations with his mother-in-law, now he's chayiv misa, but lamaisa, the relationship still has the ability to continue. What is it based on? Because the pasuk says, "V'shachav ish osa." It is only osa. It is only when she engages in an illegal relationship that the marriage is precluded from moving forward. Incredible. I'm Rabbi Reish Lakish. My time with Rabbi Yehuda. What's Rabbi Yehuda's logic? Dichsev ba'esh yisrofu oso v'yashen. So we'll say, now remember, let's go back. So we'll say, right? Rabbi Yehuda wanted to suggest that halacha l'maisa, in the case of ba'a chamos, when a man has relations with his mother-in-law, ultimately he cannot go ahead and continue his marriage. Right? What's the machlokes Yosham Beisilel on achos ishto? So let's analyze this. The pasuk says ba'ish yisrofu oso v'yashen. I will say the pasuk that says you're not allowed to have relations with your mother-in-law says in the fire they will be burned. He and them. Them. Who's the them? The chikal abayis kula b'sreifa. Remember again, this is not talking about having relations with his wife and his mother-in-law at the same time, where everybody's engaging in an act of arayos. Right? We're talking about over here, where he marries two women illegally. So bepashtos, who's the person who's chayim misa? The husband, and who else? The second woman married. So what? It sounds like you're burning down the house, right? We're going to kill everyone, right? What's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Im eno in the sreifa. Today in the Isura. I will say ultimately again, if you don't need it for Sreifa, ultimately again use it for Isura. To teach me that what Rabbi say, that halacha l'maisa, if a man has relations with his mother-in-law, according to Rabbi Yehuda, his wife becomes prohibited to him. So Rabbi say this is the position of Rabbi Yehuda, that the plurality of it means there might be one woman from the Zechi of Misa, but once a man has relations with his mother-in-law, he is no longer permitted to continue to live with his wife. Now again, we've established we don't paskin that way, but this is the position of Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rabbi Shmuel, both say first wide line, Ein Lalach Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says in Shmuel, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. So both listen to this. Hahuda Averi Yisrael Bechamasei. There was a man who had relations with his mother-in-law. See, he was married, right? And right. Clearly, albeit unhappily, has relations with his mother-in-law, right? So, Lamaisa, now what happens? This situation comes before Rabbi Yehuda. To which, I see Rabbi Yehuda, Nagde. He was brought for Rabbi Yehuda flogged him. Amarle, Ilav da Amar Shmuel, in Alach Rabbi Yehuda, were it not for the fact that Shmuel said that Allah is not Rabbi Yehuda, Asarte ale Isra de Alam. I would tell you that your wife is usher to you forever. In other words, so I would have answered you from living with your wife. But Lamaisa, again, Allah is not like Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore both say, but this is how we pass Allah Lamaisa. So obviously, if a man has relations with his mother-in-law, a man has relations with his sister-in-law, there's liability, potential capital liability, but it does not preclude him, it doesn't make his wife asura to him. That's the halacha. So the Gemara says, let's go back for just a moment. When the Gemara started this discussion, the Gemara spoke about Kavachomer and talked about an Isser Kal. What's an Isser Kal? Amrav Chista Machzir Grushaso Mishenises. So I'm sorry. Amrav Chista Machzir Grushaso Mishenises Balas. To which the Gemara says, I'm sorry, I should stop that. Machzir Grushaso. What's the case of Isser Kal? A man who remarries his divorcee. That's Isser Kal. Why? Mishra Gemara says Mishenises Bala Hai. Asra alehai, because the moment that the second husband has relations with her, she becomes prohibited to the first husband. When we say first husband is really what? Ex-husband, bala idach, and now if she transgresses, or they transgress, and ultimately she has relations with the first husband, really the former ex-husband, so bala idach, asra alehai, she becomes prohibited ultimately again to husband number two, to which the Gemara says, so again, just what that means is, Ruvain's married to Rachel, right? Ruvain divorces Rachel. Okay, she's still, right? You can still remarry your divorcee. Rachel marries Shimon. Once Shimon has relations with Rachel, Rachel becomes prohibited to Ruvain. If Shimon now divorces Rachel, right? So ultimately, again, she can't marry Reuven. If Reuven has relations with her, now ultimately, again, she becomes prohibited to who? To Shimon. So the Gemara says, so Ma'al Machzer Grushaso Mishanises Shekin Nit Mahaguf. We both say it's different. Machzer Grushaso is different because there's a certain level of physical defilement. In other words, once she lived with the second husband, she's not permitted to go back to the first husband. The Isura Barov, and furthermore, again, ultimately, again, the Isra applies to all men. The Isura Isra Olam, and ultimately what? There is an eternal Isra. Ala Amrei Shlakish Yevama. What's the case? What's the Isra Kal? Isra Kal is a case of a Yevama who lives with a man who's not her Yavam. To which the Gemara says, Yevama Laman. If you're talking about to someone else who's not her Yavam, Ukid Rav Hamnuna, Shomeres Yavam Shezin Sasru Yevama, that a Shomeres Yavam who had relations with a man who's not her Yavam becomes prohibited to the Yavam. Mali Yevama Shekinit Mahaguf. Sirbo say these are cases ultimately, again, where there's what we'll call a level of physical defilement. The Surah Barov, and the Isra applies to everyone. Eli Yevama la'achin. Rather, I will say, must be a case of the Yevama to the other brothers. What's the case? Avad ba ma'amar. Hi, if one brother does ma'amar with her, asra ala dahai. She ultimately becomes prohibited to the other. Ba'ala idach. If then another brother has relations with her, asra ala dahai. She is prohibited to this one. To which the Gemara says, "My area shabala sheni." Why did you have to set it up as a case where another brother is having relations with her? Afilu avad ba nami ma'amar. Or you could even talk about a case where one brother does ma'amar and a second brother does ma'amar. So the Gemara says, "Halo kashya Rabbi Gamliel da amar ein ma'amar achar ma'amar." That's the position Rabbi Gamliel holds. Once one brother does ma'amar, a second brother cannot. Ella afilu nasan la get va'afilu chalatz la. So set it up as a case of where one is giving her a get or doing chalitza. Ella Amar Rabbi Yochanan Sota. Now we'll say, again, just to be clear, all we're just trying to figure out is you made a kavachomer on the top of the daf, and the kavachomer spoke about an Isser Kal. We're just trying to figure out, by the way, what's the Isser Kal that the Gemara is referring to? Rather, it must be Sota. So Gemara says, okay. Let's remember again, Sota is the woman suspected of adultery and being taken to the Beis HaMikdash to drink the waters to determine her guilt or innocence. So Sota Laman, who is this Sota having relations with? Ilema Labal, if you tell me she's having relations with her husband, Ba'ala Baal, Asra ala de Baal. If she ultimately, Ba'ala Baal, Asra ala de Baal. So I'll say ultimately again, if she has relations with the Baal, she's Asra to the Baal. Really? Ma'ir Ba'ala, Afilu Nasan Laget. Even if ultimately he gives her a get, she still has her to the boel. Even if she says, I'm not drinking, she still has her to the boel. Ella sota leboel. Rather, we're talking about the nature of the prohibition of the sota to the man with whom she's suspected of committing adultery. To which the Gemara says, Hi Isser Kalu, that's not an Isser Kal, that's an Isser Chomer, Tahainu Eishes Ish. I will say the prohibition of, or the nature of the prohibition between the sota and the man with whom she committed adultery cannot be called an Isser Kal. That's adultery. Hainu Eishes Ish. I will say Amud Beis. Ella Amar Rava Eishes Ish. Oh, okay. I will say. What's the again? This is why I said it to you before when we learned the Gemara. But what's the case ultimately again of Isser Kal that the Gemara is referring to over here? The Isser Kal referred to in the Gemara is the Isser of Eishes Ish. Eishes Ish. We'll say, take a look at Rashi. Rashi's top Rashi, Tzadik Yem Beis. V'hainu Isser Kal legabe achos isha lefi she'ein ha'oser osra kol yamav. So I will say, how can you call Eishes Ish an Isser Kal? So I will say, the reason is because, we'll say, everything, the Maharal says that sometimes the only way you understand the meaning of one thing is by going ahead and understanding the opposite of it. So the Maharal discusses why is it that Klal Yisrael suffers so much? Because we're going to have such a beautiful gula, such a beautiful redemption. But to appreciate the greatness of redemption, what do you have to see? Suffering. Suffering. You can't appreciate redemption if you never suffered. So Klal Yisrael experiences such acute suffering because it's going to intensify and enhance our appreciation for the greatness of the Geula. So I will say, lahavdil, within the realm of Isser, sometimes the only way to understand the nature of the severity of an Isser is to contrast with something else. So if you put two Isurim side by side, the Isser of Eshes Ish and Achos Isha, if you put those side by side, Eshes Ish is the Isser Kal, and Achos Isha is the Isser Chamer. Why? Why? Listen to this. Because I will say very simple. Eshes Ish, is it eternal? Is it eternal? No. Right? How do you terminate the Isser Eshes Ish? Death or get. Death or get. Achos Isha, I will say, is it eternal? To a certain degree it is. Because Lamaisa Achos Isha applies even outside of the context of marriage. So even after a man terminates his marriage to a particular woman, her sister still remains prohibited. Look at Rashi. Hainu Isser Kalagabe Achos Isha Lefisha Ein HaOser Osra Kol Yamav Shafilu Bechayev Yesh La Heter Beget. See, I will say when you're married to someone, that marriage doesn't have to be eternal. There's a way to terminate marriage. A get. Aval Ishto HaOsarto Ba'achosa Osarto Kol Yameha. But I will say, once you're married to a woman, you become prohibited to her sister all the days of her life. So marriage has a termination option even during the lifetime of the parties. Right? Achos Isha, that Isser, does not have a termination option during the life of the parties. Quite fascinating. Therefore, again, the Gemara calls Eshes Ish, the Gemara calls adultery the Isser Kal, so to speak. Fascinating. Elamarava Eshes Ish, the Chenki Asar Rabban Rabbi Yochanan will say second line on the Keren base on Rabbi Yochanan, Eshes Ish, Umay Kari La Isser Kal. Why do we call Eshes Ish an Isser Kal? She'ein HaOsra Osra Kol Yamav. Because Rabbi will say the husband who prohibits his wife in Eshes Ish does not prohibit her all the days of her life. We'll say, why doesn't it prohibit her all the days of life? Why not? There's an out. What's the out? Get. So I will say, so again, the simple, so we'll see here the distinction. Eshes Ish, that prohibition does not necessarily devolve upon the parties during their entire lifetime, right? There's an exit option. Get. Achos Isha, wife's sister, that prohibition devolves upon both parties all the days of their lives. Incredible. Tainach, right? So that support says, Abba Chanam Mishum Relazar, Eshes Ish, Uma b'makom ha'ba'al Isser Kal. So now let's say the Kavachomer again. Uma b'makom ha'ba'al Isser Kal. She'ein ha'osra, Osra Kol Yamav, Ne'esar ha'oser. So I would have thought like this. In the case of Isser Kal, where the husband does not prohibit his wife all the days of her life, ultimately, Ha'ba'al Isser Chamar, Sha'osra Osarta, Kol Yimei Chayev, Inodin Shnesa Osa. Remember, going to say, what was the Kavachomer? Remember the Kavachomer? The Kavachomer was, if in an Isser Kal, where the wife goes ahead and transgresses, becomes prohibited to her husband, then in the case of an Isser Chamar, which is Achos Isha, where one of the parties transgresses, what's the transgression over here? Husband accidentally has relations with his sister-in-law because he thought his wife was dead, certainly should prohibit the wife. Right? Inodin Shnesa Osa Tamulamar Osa Shchivas Osarta Vein Shchivas Achos Osarta. So I will say three important pieces of halacha l'maisa emerge from this sugi. Number one, we adopt this drasha of Osa, which means that it's a kind of three that is really all one. So I will say, which teaches me what? Osa teaches me the only type of relationship that prevents a marriage going forward is when the wife illegally engages in an illicit relationship. That's what kind of brings the marriage to a screeching halt. It brings it to a halt mid-da'oraisa if it was b'mezid, and mid-rabbanan even if it was b'shogeg. But when the husband engages in an illicit relationship, now again, it does not bring the marriage to a halt. In other words, they are still permitted as a couple to live together. Now again, Abbas, I want to be clear. It does not mean that when the husband engages in an illicit relationship, that he emerges without culpability. Again, in the case where he has relations with the mother-in-law, chiyev misa, relations with his sister-in-law, chiyev misa, but it does not prevent the marriage from going forward. What is that based on? A pasuk. I will say it's all the pasuk of Osa. The shachav ish Osa. It is only osa. It is only when she engages in an illicit relationship that the marriage is unable to continue. Rabbi Yossi saying that is halacha l'maisa. Beautiful. I mean, not beautiful, but you understand. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Good. Rabbi Yossi says kol shepolsa. So let's remember again, we have this interesting statement in the Mishnah, right? Rabbi Yossi essentially said like this. I'm reading to the Mishnah. Kol shepolsa ayedei achirim polsa ayedei atzmo. So which essentially means anyone who passels others himself becomes passel. But anyone who does not passel others himself doesn't become passel. To which the Gemara says, "My Kamar Rabbi Yossi, what are you talking about? What are you talking about?" So watch this. So we'll say, now here's what we know. Rabbi Yossi seems to be arguing on the Tanakama. Not seems. Rabbi Yossi is arguing on the Tanakama. Seems to be arguing on the Tanakama. Right? So I'll say, what is Rabbi Yossi arguing on? So listen to this. So Tanakama is going to say like this. Remember again, we've established what's the case. What's the case? Not only is Rachel, Ruvain's wife, going overseas, but who is Rachel going overseas with? Shimon, her brother-in-law, right? Her sister's husband, Leah's husband. Okay, so Tanakama says the Azal Isha Ishto Vigislam Dinasayam. So Ruvain, his wife and his brother-in-law went overseas. They say, by the way, I want to point out that sounds shady by itself, but let me say again, it doesn't mean they went together. In other words, Rachel went to Eretz Yisrael and Shimon went to China. Like it doesn't mean they're traveling together. The point is they're both gone together, and testimony comes back about both of them. So now watch this. So Eishes Giso Asira v'ishto Sharia. So most remember again. Now, what's the net effect? Ruvain ends up marrying who? Let's play this out. Ruvain marries who? Leah, his wife's sister. So now what happens? Now again, and they're both acting legally because Ruvain got testimony that Rachel died, and Leah got testimony that what? Shimon died. Now it turns out who shows up? Rachel and Shimon. Shabbos say. Now remember again. So there's two families over here. So Ruvain is permitted to go ahead and continue to live with his wife. They both say, what about Leah and Shimon? No, because Leah inadvertently committed adultery. So Leah can't, so we'll say, so it's two disparate halachas. As much as Ruvain and Rachel are permitted to continue their marriage, Shimon and Leah cannot. So the Gemara says, so the halacha is, Eishes Giso Asira, V'ishto Sharia. So literally again, his brother-in-law's wife, i.e. Leah, is not permitted to live with her husband. And ultimately again, Rachel is. The Kamar Rabbi Yossi, and maybe Rabbi Yossi saying is like this. Kihechi de ishto Sharia, Eishes Giso Nami Sharia. Maybe Rabbi Yossi saying is like this. That doesn't make sense. If Rachel's going to be permitted to resume living with her husband, then what? Leah should be permitted to resume living with her husband as well. In other words, this is all one tangled web. So whatever is going to apply to one side of the equation should apply to the other. So if Rachel is permitted to continue living with her husband, then Leah should be permitted as well. Maybe that's what Rabbi Yossi is saying. Well, that's Rabbi Yossi is saying, Ihachi, kol shein posa ayedei achirim ein posa ayedei atzmo. Then instead of the Mishnah saying, whoever doesn't passel themselves whoever doesn't passel others doesn't passel themselves, it should really say, kol shein posel ayedei atzmo eino posel ayedei achirim bay. But then it should really say any person who is not passel themselves should not passel others. Ve'ela, so I'll say that came out of Rabbi Yossi saying ve'ela kihechi de'esh. So maybe Rabbi Yossi saying is like this: kihechi de'eshes giso asira ishto nami asira. Maybe Rabbi Yossi saying is like this. In reality, the same way that halacha l'maisa, Leah is going to be prohibited to her husband. Rabbi Yossi says that what? Rachel should be prohibited to Ruvain. In other words, that's Rabbi Yossi's arguing. If that's the case, to which the Gemara says, Hatinach kol sheposel, kol she'ena posel ma'avidate. So I'll say, if that's the case, then I understand the first part of the phrase of kol sheposel. But what does kol she'ena posel mean? Rabbi Ami Aresha. So we'll say, again, we're just trying to figure out what is Rabbi Yossi saying. I know the words, right? Whoever doesn't compromise, others doesn't compromise. Whoever doesn't passel, others doesn't passel themselves. Whoever passels, others passel themselves. I just don't know what he's talking about. So we'll say, so we're still at a loss. What is Rabbi Yossi coming to say? To which the Gemara says, you're focusing on the wrong case. Listen to this. Rabbi Ami Aresha. Wow. Watch this. Rabbi Yossi is actually commenting on the first line in the first part of the Mishnah, Rabbi says, go back. What was the first part of the Mishnah? Nises api bezdin teitse upetura min karban. Suppose listen to this. What was the first part of the Mishnah? The first part of the Mishnah, if you look at Rashi, by the way, actually, let's just do it in the Gemara. So listen to this. Nises api bezdin. So I will say, ultimately, if a woman got married api bezdin. Well, let's go back for just a moment. This is where the husband went overseas. Right? And Lamaisa, what happened over here? Wet witness comes along and tells her that her husband is dead. So what's her status? Listen to this. Nises api bezdin. I remember again, the wording here is interesting. We saw, what does api bezdin mean? What does api bezdin? Eid echad. Because remember again, when you have two witnesses, you don't need bezdin. So if she got married based on an Eid echad, so we'll say, now what happens? So right, Rachel's told that Reuven's dead. From an Eid echad, she goes and she gets remarried. Then it turns out that Reuven's alive. What's her status? Teitze. So unfortunately now she cannot remain married to either one of the two men. However, upetura min karban. We'll say, but she's parted from karban. Why is she parted from karban? Why? Because any time you act under the umbrella of Beis Din, you have carbonic coverage. Right? You don't have to bring a carbon, although that's subject to dispute as well. Api edim, but if she gets married based on the testimony of two witnesses, then what? Teitze, she still has to leave both husbands, right? But the chayev is bekarban. But Abba says she's chayev in a carbon. Why? Because Lamai said two witnesses, she's getting married, she has no carbonic coverage because she's not getting married under the auspices of Beis Din. In this case, what do you see? Yafek kocho shel Beis Din shepacha min ha-karban. Rabbi say, what do you see from here? You see from here that Allah Lamaisa sometimes, not sometimes, but the koach of Beis Din is strong in that Beis Din gives you carbonic coverage. So Rabbi say, so fine. So Rabbi say, so that's the statement, right? That's just the Mishnah. That's right. That's straight out. Now watch this. The Tanakama comes along and says, Lo shanu api edim the eishes giso sharia. So I'll say ultimately again, Lemaisa, it makes no difference if at the end of the day, we'll say, we're going to stop over for today. We'll pick up with this piece. Okay, we're a little bit more caught up, right? We'll pick up with this piece. Emir said, we'll pick up on this part tomorrow. We'll say, so again, I just wanted to show you where we're leaving off. Where we're leaving off is, we have something to Rabbi Yossi, right? Rabbi Yossi says, whoever doesn't passel others doesn't passel themselves. Whoever passels others passels themselves. Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi, what are you talking about? So we thought initially that Rabbi Yossi ultimately was commenting on the statement right beforehand. And maybe what he's commenting on is the seeming inequity, right? Seeming inequity between the way we treat Reuven's wife and ultimately Leah, right? And Shimon's wife. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not what we're talking about. Rabbi Yossi is commenting ultimately on the Reisha, the first case of the Mishnah. Explanation, Emir Tashim, and resolution to be continued tomorrow. Shkoyach. Good Shabbos.